All right. So before we start talking about actually drying and preserving options, I want to just mention a couple harvesting basics and before we kind of jump in. So, when it comes to harvesting, when you're doing herbs and flowers specifically, we're going to kind of group those together for our process today or our conversation today. But when it comes to harvesting different flowers or herbs, there are a couple ways. A couple parts that you can harvest, right? So, one of the main things that we can harvest are the leaves and the flower blooms. Most of the time, that you can just pick those pieces off and dry those as or pick them off and use them as you need. When it comes to picking or harvesting your herbs and flowers, there are a couple of things you want to kind of keep an eye out for. You definitely want to use the healthiest part. Especially because we're ingesting, we're eating, we're drinking these things, we want to use the healthiest parts. And so we want to check, keep an eye out for white or brown spots, maybe some yellowing, like pale bloom, pale coloring, blemishes, those things. We want to keep an eye out for those. The best parts of the flower, the blooms and the leaves to harvest are going to be the ones that are blemish free. And many of the blooms you can pluck off and just dry whole. Things like chamomile or lavender, dandelion. And I'm going to show in a moment a couple ways to dry. But those are the things to kind of keep an eye out for when it comes to the harvesting the flowers and leaves. Now, there are some plants where roots are really beneficial. I know recently we've been talking about dandelion a lot, and dandelion is one of those. The roots of the dandelion are so beneficial, and you can use them in a variety of ways. But when it comes to roots, I've found that the best time to harvest those roots are generally in the fall. And that's because that's when plants are really starting to focus their energy on the roots for the winter. And of course, you take what you need and you leave the majority of it in the ground to continue growing. Many of the roots that you can harvest, earlier in this series we talked about ginger root. Ginger is one of those. You can get that ginger from the grocery store and stick it in the dirt, and it'll continue to grow. You can cut off what you want, what you can use, and leave the wet rest to continue growing. This also works for dandelion and echinacea, things like that. Just real quick, those harvesting basics. We want to look for the blemish-free parts of the plant. Those are the best ones to harvest. And then roots, it's taking what we need and leaving the rest to grow. Now let's hop over to um, that drying and preserving. So some tips for drying our herbs. And again, we're going to be focusing on herbs and flowers today. But growing herbs, harvesting those herbs, drying those herbs, you want to think about where you want to dry them. Most of the time, I usually do an air dry where I hang them up and they just dry naturally in the air. You can also do an oven drying or use a dehydrator. Those are two other ways to dry your herbs and flowers. One of the things I will say about using an oven or a dehydrator is that when it comes to harvesting our plants, right, we get a lot of health benefits from different plants. And most of those health benefits come from the natural oil that's inside the plant. And whenever you apply heat, it kind of releases those natural oils. And so when we're drying our plants, we want to make sure that we're drying in a way that the plant hangs on to most of those oils so we can get those benefits, get as many of those benefits as we can, right? And so oven drying, one of the things to keep in mind with oven drying is that heat is being applied. And so some of those natural oils are going to be kind of released, right? The same with the dehydrator. A dehydrator is definitely a more controlled way to dry herbs and flowers, definitely a more even way to dry herbs and flowers. But again, there's a little heat that's applied. And so heat has a way of releasing some of those natural oils. I have found I generally stick to air drying, which is hanging my herbs up and letting them dry naturally. Now, it does take a couple weeks for that to happen. And as you're drying, you want to make sure you keep them in a well ventilated area away from dust and debris. You can see in the picture here that she's drying some rosemary and she's tying it in a bundle to hang it up and dry. So I'm going to just real quickly stop sharing and spotlight my hands here because I want to talk a little bit about kind of demo through ways to ways to dry, air dry our plant. Now in the handout, I also have a little illustration here of these bundles hanging upside down and tying them to like a string. Now you don't have to have fancy equipment to dry your herbs and flowers. You don't. There are some things that are more ideal than others, but the truth is, however you can hang it up and dry it, it's going to be okay. Use what you have around you. Right? So one of the things I want to talk about is when it comes to air drying our flowers. So my go-to for air drying flowers, the blooms, is to take something like an embroidery hoop and I can open it up. So I separate the top hoop from the bottom hoop. And I can do something like a cheesecloth, something that has mesh to it. I've done a paper towel before, but I've trapped it between those hoops and used that, put my flower heads on there to dry. The reason I use something like that cheesecloth or paper towel is that the air can go all the way through that, right? There's no part that's really being blocked, so it can dry more evenly. And then you just do a thin layer of your flower blooms on top, letting it air dry. So that's one way to do it. It doesn't have to be with an embroidery hoop. Like I said, anything that you have around you, you can use to create something like this. And wherever you put this to dry, so your flower heads can dry, is good, but you want to think about keeping it away from like dust and debris, right? So putting it in a safe space where it's not going to be bothered, right? So that's one way to do it. Another way I want to talk about is when we hang up our herbs to dry them. So I'm going to use some of my mint here just to demo a little bit. So I've got a couple pieces of mint and I want to dry these, right? So what I'm going to do is take the stems of my mint. Ugh, I love how fragrant mint is. You just stand next to it and you all of a sudden get like this wonderful fragrance surrounding you. But to hang dry our mint, herbs like this, and this works for basil, this works for thyme, rosemary, almost any herb you can dry this way. But what we're going to do, just like that image, that picture we showed, is we're going to kind of bundle them up a little bit, tie them together, and then hang them to dry them. Now you can use, I've got twine here that I can use, but you can also use embroidery floss. You can use yarn. You can use thread. I'm using twine, but really any type of cording will work for this process. I've even used rubber bands before. So again, whatever you have around you will work for this. What I would do is just take some of the cording. I'm just going to bundle my pieces together. So I've got my cording, my twine wrapped around it, and I'm just going to kind of tie it off. It doesn't have to be fancy, right? We're just bundling them together, tying a little knot. And then we want to hang it up. And we want to make sure that as we're bundling them, we're bundling the stems. So when we hang it up, the heads, the tips of the plants, the tops of the plants are hanging down. Now, the reason we want to do that is so all those oils that I was talking about, those natural oils, go from the stem to the leaves. They'll start drying down. And this is also a way for the plant to retain color too. So it's a good rule of thumb to hang your herbs and flowers kind of upside down. Now, there are different ways to hang them. I'll be honest, for years I used a random piece of wood, like a branch that I found in the yard. I just hung that up, cleaned it up, hung it up, and then tied my herbs and flowers to that to dry. But you don't have to bring a log inside to do that. A couple things that you can do is use a hanger. A hanger works well for drying herbs. If you have a plastic hanger, wire hanger, it doesn't matter. Just having something that you can take your twine or your yarn, whatever cording you're using, and just tie it. And then the hanger is nice because it already has the hook and you can hang it up. There are also fancy um, uh, things that you can use, herb drying contraptions that you can use that are you can get pretty easily on like Amazon or in big box stores. But the truth is, you can use stuff you have around. Maybe you have an embroidery hoop. You can use that to tie it on. A hanger works. If you have just a piece of yarn that you can stretch across something, you can hang your herbs that way too. And then this, you'll let it hang. And then it takes a couple weeks sometimes, sometimes even longer, depending on the moisture in the air. Sometimes that slows down the drying process, but generally it'll take a couple weeks to dry your plant, your herb, your flower. Now, one of the things that I want to kind of put a heavy emphasis on is that we want to make sure that our plant is completely dry before we start storing it. Because even just a little drop of moisture can invite mold into our container. And so we want to make sure that our plant is completely dry before we store it. Now there's a way to test it, right? My go-to is to take one of the leaves and bend it. And if it bends, then I know I need to dry it longer. If it breaks, then that's a good indicator that it's dry enough to put into my container, right? So this is another way to dry your herbs by hanging them up. And then this is kind of out of the way, and those plants, those leaves can dry down. All right, I'm going to go back to my, here we go. All right, so things that we've already talked about, we want to dry it in a well-ventilated area, creating those bundles to hang dry them. And then you'll know it's dry when those branches or those leaves will snap when you bend them. So when it comes to storing, um, when it comes to storing our herbs and flowers, there are a couple of things to really keep in mind. We want to store in airtight containers. You know, I mentioned earlier that we want to make sure those herbs and flowers are completely dry before we store them. If you're not sure, one of the things that I've done when it comes to storing my dried herbs is when I put them in a container, I'll check it in a day or two and see if there's any condensation around the jar. And if there is, I know that it needs to come out and dry more. If there's no condensation after a couple days, then I know my plant was completely dry and I'm generally good to go. But we want to store our dried herbs and flowers in those airtight containers, ideally in a colored container to help prevent light exposure, storing them in a dark and cool space because light helps break down those natural oils. It helps release those oils. And so keeping it in a cool, dark space away from light is a way to extend that shelf life, right? Now, dried herbs will typically last 1 to 3 years if it's stored well. And if you kind of keep an eye on a few things. One is heat, the other is humidity, sunlight, and then air. All these things have negative effects on our herbs. They break down those natural oils. And so thinking about those things can help us extend the life of our dried herbs. Now, I'm going to kind of go over each of those just a little bit. Those airtight containers. Now, oxygen leads to breakdown over time. So it's best to store those herbs in an airtight container. Glass jars, metal tins, anything that has that screw-on lid is great. So are those clamping lids. Those are great too. I will generally use glass jars, and most of that is because that's what I have. Glass jars, sometimes it's easier to get that airtight seal with like a glass jar than it is with other things. But you can use anything that's airtight to store those herbs. Sunlight is also affects our herbs, the shelf life of our herbs. We know that sunlight is super important when we're growing our plant, right? But it does help downgrade, I guess, the the dried herbs, right? So it makes it go stale faster. It's not really that it makes it go bad, but the herbs lose their potency. And again, it's because those natural oils are released with sunlight. So keeping them in a closed cabinet or in a dark shelf somewhere, that's good. I usually keep mine in a cabinet and that works really well. Humidity is another thing to keep an eye out for, to just kind of keep in mind when it comes to storing our dried herbs and flowers. Moisture is the enemy of many different food storage like processes, right? Dried herbs, flowers are no different. So if you dry those herbs yourself, you want to make sure you are getting them completely dry before you store them. So it's a good idea. Like I said, when I dry herbs, I'll put them in a jar and then check on them like 2 days later to see if there's any moisture in the jar. And if there is, I can take it out and dry the herb or the flower longer and then put it back in. And if there's no condensation, no moisture, then I can leave it as is and I'm good to go. If you are in an area where there's a lot of humidity, I grew up in the South, so there was a lot of humidity there. One of the things that we did was stick like a bean or a grain of rice in there with it and help collect the moisture. And you have to kind of change that out every like month or so, but it does help prevent that humidity from affecting our dried herbs and flowers. And then, of course, temperature is another thing that helps kind of break down the shelf life, shorten the shelf life. Um, where you store your herbs makes a huge difference. You can keep them in your fridge or freezer, but you don't have to. Room temperature really is fine. But you want to avoid storing them right next to the stove or the dryer, anywhere there might be a lot of steam, because again, that steam helps release some of those natural oils. So again, just keeping it in a cabinet is a great way to go. I want to go back for just a moment and talk a little bit about the storage containers, talk about glass versus plastic. So if you are drying and storing your herbs, you basically have a choice to make. What do we store them in, glass or plastic? Ultimately, the best storage container is one that's airtight, no matter what the material might be, because we want to that air, keep it away from the air, right? I generally use glass because I have found that plastic a lot of times will take on the odor of whatever plant herb is in there. So let's say you have a plastic container and you're storing mint, dried mint in there. When you're done with that dried mint and you want to clean it out and put another herb in there, say I'm putting basil in there, sometimes you still get that mint odor because that plastic kind of soaks up and hangs on to that odor. And glass is generally easier to sterilize. But again, the truth is, as long as you can get an airtight container, you're doing okay. You don't have to go buy fancy jars. You can use what you have. I know several times I've used empty spice jars or seasoning jars that I've used up. I've cleaned those up and used those to hold some of the dried herbs and flowers that I grow. And generally, to get a better seal, anything that you can screw on or has that clamp lid is a more ideal way to store it. Now, just real quickly, there are a couple ways to tell when your herbs have gone bad. And when I say go bad, I don't mean like they're like going bad, basically. It's just that they're losing potency. The older the herb is, the less potent it is. And so there are a couple ways to kind of check your herbs and flowers to make sure that they're still pretty potent All right. One way is to kind of crush that leaf or that flower in your fingers. And if it has a strong smell, then you know that it's still pretty potent. You want to check also for discoloration. So if it started out a bright green and now it's kind of a dull color, that's a good indicator that it's going stale. And then of course a little taste test to taste it really quickly and see if it's still strong. Again, it doesn't mean that it's going bad, really. It's just losing its potency. And so that's just kind of a couple ways to kind of check on that. One of the things that I would recommend to make your dried herbs last longer is to keep them whole. So keeping them as whole as possible for as long as possible, even when you're storing it, helps keep all those natural oils inside. Once we start breaking down, chopping, cutting, tearing those herbs, those natural oils start to be released, right? And so keeping them whole will help them last longer. And the same is true for like spices and herbs too that you get in the store. The more whole it is, the more of those oils, those natural oils, are in there. And then once you start grinding, cutting, chopping, whatever, it releases those oils. So, like I said, the same is true for spices as well. Now, let's go on to other ways to preserve our herbs. Now, this is not an exclusive list. These are just some of the things that I have done or that I've seen other people do that have brought success. And if you have any experience in other ways to preserve herbs and flowers, definitely share those. It's good. We learn from each other. So the first one I want to kind of mention is freezing those herbs in water or in oil. Now, some of the advantages to freezing herbs is that it helps retain the flavor. It helps hang on to those nutrients. Freezing herbs preserves that very fresh flavor, that nutrient content that sometimes can get lost in other preservation, I guess, methods. It has a longer shelf life when it's frozen. It slows down that aging process. And so freezing it, you can store it for 6 months or more, right? It has a longer shelf life. And freezing them, whether it's in water or oil, freezing them, it doesn't require any special equipment, right? Doesn't require any special skills. What I do is I'll chop up the herbs and put them in an ice cube tray and then fill it with water or oil and freeze it. There are a couple of things to think about though, not disadvantages, but things to keep in mind if you're going to freeze those herbs or flowers in oil or water. One is that the texture might be affected. It might become limp or mushy, which is not bad, but it does affect the texture. And it kind of has limited uses this way. So it's going to be best used in dishes that are cooked, things like sautés, soups, stews, things like that. And of course, it takes up freezer space. So those of us with limited freezer space, this may not be the best option for us, and that's okay. It's just one of the many options, right? So one of the things that I do like mentioning here is when you're freezing it in water, you're making like herb ice cubes. And so if you're making like lemonade or something like that, you can use, like if you're freezing mint in an ice cube, you can add that to your lemonade and it can infuse that lemonade too. So you can have some kind of out of the box uses for this as well. Like I said, they don't really hold their texture well. And so you want to kind of chop it or tear it to kind of add to those ice cubes. And when it comes to trying to decide if you want to do it in water or oil, just kind of think about what you're going to use that herb for. Are you going to use it to infuse drinks? Maybe you're going to use it for a saute. You might as well like freeze it in oil that way, save yourself a step. So it does help to kind of think about what you are going to be using this herb for before you freeze it. Some of the best herbs to use frozen are going to be things like basil, mint, cilantro, sage, dill, parsley, oregano, thyme. I mean, there are a lot of herbs that do well this way. So that's one option. Once they're frozen, you can pop them out of that ice tray and store them in a freezer bag or container in the freezer. And like I said, they'll last for a while. They'll have a longer shelf life. Another way to preserve herbs and flowers is through sugar. So sugar preserving doesn't work for some flavors of herbs, right? So you can use the sugar preservation as a rim on a cocktail. You can use it to make simple syrup. You can bake with it. There are several options for this process. I will say this is one I don't use often. I will freeze it in oil generally before doing this, but I know that this can be a fun way to preserve it and use those herbs too. Some of the advantages of preserving herbs in sugar is that it does have a longer shelf life. That sugar can preserve the flavor and the aroma for several months or more, right? It can add sweetness. So it helps give that herb or that flower that sweet and aromatic flavor, and it can add a unique taste to dishes. So if you do a lot of baking, this may be a fun way to bring in some other flavors. You can use it in a lot of desserts. You can use it in teas and cocktails. So using it in sugar can be a good idea and another option. Some of the things to keep in mind about using sugar is that, again, not all herbs do well with sugar, taste good with sugar. Some may lose their flavor during the sugaring process. That's okay. And texture sometimes can be affected. They can get kind of sticky or clumped together, and it can affect the texture and appearance. And because you're storing it in sugar, sometimes it can be too sweet. So those are kind of things to kind of keep in mind if you're using that sugar method. And of course, you can chop dry your herbs, chop them up, mix them in with that sugar, put them in what is it, food processor to mix them all together. And that can be a good gift too. Flavored sugar, an herb or flower sugar can be a nice gift as well. Some of the best herbs to use with this method and the sugar are things like mint, lemon balm, lavender, rosemary, thyme, sage. I have a sister who used to own a pie shop, and one of the things that she would do is make her own simple syrups. And she was constantly using herbs and flowers to create these simple syrups, things like rosemary and basil. Those are things you don't really think about adding to like baked goods, but they add great flavoring. So you can be really clever with how you cook too, bringing this in as well. Now, salt preservation, this is one I do often. And this is one I really enjoy because it also makes really great gifts. But salt preservation, because it looks pretty, and I'll talk about that in a second. But some of the advantages to preserving in salt, again, is that it lengthens the shelf life. So herbs that are preserved in salt can last for several months or more, longer. Salt also helps intensify the flavor. So these salt preserved herbs can have a more intense flavor or smell than fresh herbs. So they're perfect for seasoning, right? You make your own seasoned salt. And just like these others, it's pretty easy to prepare because you don't have to have special equipment or special skills, right? You're using salt and you're using your herbs and then just storing them in an airtight container. Some of the things to keep in mind when it comes to preserving things in salt is that it can be too salty. Right? So salt preserved herbs, because they are being preserved in salt, they can take on some of that saltiness, right? So it's important sometimes to rinse off some of that excess salt if you're storing it whole in the salt. It may lose some of those nutrients, but not a whole lot. And the texture sometimes can be affected as well. They can become soft, and so not good for dishes that need a more firm texture, right? Like I said, this is one of my favorite ways to preserve herbs because I'll make seasoning salts. So it's drying different herbs, chopping it up, blending it with salt, mixing it in with salt, and then putting it in a container. And you can mix some really great herbs and even flowers together to create not just a pretty gift, but a useful one as well. So it's kind of nice to think about that also. But some of the best herbs to use that work well, I guess, with salt preservation are things like cilantro, parsley, chives, dill, thyme, rosemary. And you can also add in, just as a side note, you can add in like dried fruit as well, make a really, really fun seasoning mixture. So that's an option as well. Another option that I don't think that I forget about, let me just say that I forget about, but is also a kind of a fun way to store herbs, preserve your herbs, is by making butter, basically an herbed butter. It doesn't really make your herbs last longer unless you freeze it after you mix it together, but doing an herbed butter is kind of a fun way to spice up your dish, and also to use some of those herbs that you've been growing. Some of the advantages to using to preserving herbs in butter is that it does add flavor. That butter picks up the flavor of those herbs, and so it kind of intensifies that flavor. It does have a slightly longer shelf life, especially if you freeze it. It can last for a few weeks or more. And it's pretty versatile. If you mix it in with that butter, you get a versatile supply, right? You can use it in a wide variety of dishes, from like sautés, spreading on toast, adding to pasta, enhancing the flavor of meats. If you're grilling meats, this herb butter is a really good option. And you're just softening that butter and adding those herbs to it, mixing that in. So you can combine herbs in a fun way as well. Some of the things to keep in mind if doing this process is that butter sometimes is high in fat. And so that's just something to kind of keep in mind. Once you add those herbs to butter, it does kind of shorten that shelf life a little bit. But you can store it in the freezer if you want, or make small portions of it to use. It also it also may mask or overpower, shall we say, some other flavors because that butter takes on the flavor, the aroma of the herb. It can intensify it in a dish. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind too. Now, when it comes to adding those herbs to butter, you can do the dried herbs, or you can do fresh herbs. But with the fresh herbs, you want to make sure that you kind of pat them dry at least before you mix them in. Some of the best herbs to use in butter preservation are things like rosemary and thyme, basil, chives, parsley, oregano. Those are really great options. Honey preservation. This is one I think we don't think about often. I have tried it once and really, really enjoyed it. And so this is kind of one we're adding in there just to kind of talk about a little bit. But honey, we know honey is known for being an excellent natural preservative. Raw honey it actually has some of health benefits on its own. Raw honey has antibacterial properties, it has antifungal properties, it has antiviral properties. Like raw honey is really good to add in our diet, right? And so adding those fresh herbs or flowers can really be a fun twist on honey. Some of the advantages to preserving herbs and flowers in honey is that it does add sweetness to those herbs and flowers. It has a longer shelf life. It can last for several months or more if it's stored well in a dark space, a cabinet. And it can be pretty versatile. You can use it in a lot of dishes, like desserts or baked goods. You can add it to drinks and teas. That's some ways to use the honey. Now, some of the things to keep in mind is that it can be too sweet. Honey is a sweetener, and so it can overpower some other flavors that are used in whatever you're making. Honey may also like change the texture of the herb or the flower too. And sometimes it can be expensive. Honey can be pricey. So this is just kind of an option if you have some raw honey and you're thinking about different ways to use your herbs. This is an option. Some of the best herbs to use with honey are going to be things like lavender, rosemary, thyme, sage, lemon balm, mint, chamomile. Those are all some really good options. Now, when it comes to preserving it in honey, you want to make sure that you let it infuse in the honey for a month or so, and then strain it out. You don't want to leave those herbs in there. You want to make sure you're straining that out before you use it as well. This next one is one I do often. I really like this process. It's oil preservation. So it's really infusing oil with your herb or your flower. Some of the advantages to preserving an oil is that it can preserve that flavor and the aroma. It's also very versatile. The oil preserved herbs can be used in a wide variety of dishes, from like sauteing, doing dressings or marinades, creating dips. This is a really great option, and it has a long shelf life, so it can last for several months this way. Some of the things to keep in mind is that sometimes it can be expensive getting a good quality oil. It can be more expensive than some of the other methods. And it definitely changes the texture of the herb. So when you are making an infused oil with your herb, you want to make sure that as you are pouring the oil over the herb, that the herb is completely submerged in that oil. And then after it's infused, you can take the herb out. You want to strain it. This is also a really great gift too. I know some herbs that we grow kind of really grow. So you start getting a whole lot of it. And this is one way to use that to preserve it and to share it. Some of the things that that I really appreciate or really enjoy about this infusing the oil is that it really does make a nice gift. And it's like that oil really holds the flavor of the herbs that you put into it. So it's really good. Even just using the oil for dipping bread into, it can add a lot of flavor that way as well. Some of the best herbs for infusing in oil would be things like rosemary, thyme, basil, oregano, sage, lemon balm, even lavender does well in oil. And then the last method that I want to kind of mention is infusing vinegar. So preserving our herbs or flowers in vinegar. And this is kind of the same with the oil. Some of the advantages are that it helps preserve that flavor and the smell. It's very versatile. If you're infusing vinegar, then you can use it in a variety of dishes like salads, creating salad dressing with it, or marinades. It's really good for those. And using it in vinegar kind of inhibits the bacterial growth, right? Because vinegar has so much acidity in it, it can inhibit that growth, which is kind of nice. Vinegar is just, anyway, a great thing to have on hand. Most of us do have on hand. So it's easy to it can be easy to infuse that vinegar and use it in our cooking, right? Some of the things to think about is that it can be too acidic. Vinegar has a strong smell and a strong taste. And so it can kind of overpower some other flavors too. And it changes the texture of your herb or the appearance of the herb. they can become a little wilted. And just as a reminder, we all know, but vinegar has a very, very strong smell. And so that can kind of take over, affect the taste too. But like I said, it's really great if you make your own salad dressings or marinades. Infusing it with these herbs can be a good option. Um, and like I said, you can use it in a variety of ways, even making sauces with it. Um, and some of the best herbs to infuse with vinegar are things like thyme, rosemary, basil, sage, parsley, um, just a lot of different herbs there. So I know that we went through a whole lot of information. Um, I hope it was helpful, but I do want to kind of open up while we've got a little time left. If there are any questions that are coming up, that's a good question. So my first instinct is to say measure with your heart. So like what feel like we all have different taste buds, and so we're gonna want like different amounts. I think a good rule of thumb when you're mixing it with salt is to kind of just like break it down and do even parts. I know we're all different. We have different tastes. I generally will do more salt than I do like the dried herbs or flowers in it. It really, I know like the measure with your heart is not a really good example, but you can adjust it too. If you find that you want more herbal flavor, like your more herb flavor to it, add more herbs to it. If you want less salt flavor, pull some of that salt out. Yeah.
Awesome. We just got a question in the chat about how use the herbs frozen in water. So if you're going to throw it in a pot, do you recommend like thawing it and draining the water or just throwing it in?
So I will say when I freeze herbs in water, it's usually to make ice cubes. I know you can freeze the herbs kind of whole in water and dry it out that way. But if you're cooking, most of the time when I'm going to be using it to cook with, I'll just go ahead and put it in the oil. And I usually, and this is just like personal experience, I just use freezing it in water if I'm going to add it to drinks and things.
Another one I have written down, someone was asking if you can use the drying packets, like the kinds that come in like your vitamins, and store those with your dried herbs. I don't know if that's anything we have experience with.
The drying. Are those like you're talking about the things that you find like when you get a new purse and there's like that little packet in the bottom or like is that what I'm
I think in this case they were ones that had been stored with edible things before with the vitamins.
mm, I I would say no to that because that I don't know how well that would dry or keep moisture out. I think it's like when I want to make sure that those herbs that I'm drying stay dry, I usually add like I said, a grain or two of salt or a couple beans in there and use that instead. I think that's a little safer, maybe.
Can you repeat again? Did you mention dry beans and rice as things you could store with them?
Those are things that I have used that I have found helpful. Like grain of rice, it keeps salt from clumping. Like the little grains of rice are really helpful, and you don't need a lot of them, and they really do help keep some of that moisture out. Yeah, and of course, if any questions come up outside of our time together, I know our time is almost up, but if any questions come up outside of our time together, always feel free to reach out. That Kids at Mather email is going to be the best one for this one. And if you're wanting some of the back handouts, send us an email. We can send that to you as well. I know our time is almost up, but are there any last questions or comments before we end our time together today? These have been really great questions. I know it was a whole lot of information, but hopefully there were some informative things. Yeah, so if it's starting to mold, you definitely want to keep that out. You don't want to get that to transfer to your other plants at all. I would say get rid of it to prevent the mold. I think
Right.
sometimes what makes it uh, too much, I guess, where that invites that mold in is when there's too much moisture, when the soil is like overwatered, things like that. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I know our time is up and we definitely want to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you for joining us, for taking part in this session. I'm looking forward to being back with you all next month, and definitely keep an eye out for some more garden programming that's coming your way. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone, and we'll see you soon. Bye.